The area that would become Pike County, Kentucky, was home to dark valleys and frozen rivers. It was one of the most remote mountains in the Appalachians. People who lived there talked about a famous hunter whose shots never missed. Ezekiel Harmon would go into the woods for weeks at a time and come back with enough pelts to keep whole families alive through harsh winters. Like these old mountains, legends often hold secrets deep inside them. When some of these secrets come out, they show terrible things that no one can understand. In the fall of 1832, a hurt man rode up to a remote farm and made a confession that would change the land forever. Even the toughest people who lived on the frontier would be shocked by what was found after his death. This is a scary story about a predator who crossed the line between hunter and monster, between survival and sadism. Please tell us where you are watching from before we go on. If this is your first time at Legacy of Fear, sign up so you don't miss any of the stories we tell. You'll want to follow every new piece of information. Get ready to meet the Appalachian Cannibal. It took more than bravery to live in what would later become Pike County, Kentucky. The Appalachian Mountains rose like natural walls, separating settlements where pioneers had to deal with harsh winters, wild animals, and constant fights with native tribes. In that area, where nature made its own rules, lore and civilization seemed far away. Ezekiel Harmon was more at home in those woods than in human society. The hunter was 36 years old and had become a living legend, a mysterious person who made people both admire and feel uneasy. His skills went beyond what settlers thought was possible for a person. There was nothing about his looks that made him look very strong. He was 5 feet 8 inches tall and had a thin, nervous body that made him look like he was starving. But people turned away from his gray eyes because they were so penetrating. His dark brown hair was always messy and looked like it had never seen a comb or scissors. His real fame came from his supernatural ability to follow and stay alive. He would disappear for months into the mountains, only to come back with beaver, deer, and bear skins that were worth a lot of money in Prestonburg, the trading settlement that was set up in 1797. Families relied on the meat he gave away, and not many people questioned how much he gave away. But there were also darker stories going around. Shawnee warriors stopped going to some valleys and trails. Men who had hunted in that area for years and knew every rock refused to hunt in areas they used to love. They talked in hushed tones about a white ghost whose trail vanished like smoke. Zeke only thought of Silas Godfrey, a 52-year-old farmer who lived 5 miles south of the settlements, as a friend. Silas and the young orphan, who was 12 years old at the time, started their relationship when Silas found him alone after seeing his father get killed in a brutal way. He would always remember how the boy looked next to the body of Thomas Harmon, who was killed and scalped by Shawnee warriors near the Levisa Fork River in 1808. Those gray eyes were cold and determined, with no tears or screams. Along with his father, something had died in that boy. In its place, something much darker had come to life. Over time, Silas saw Zeke become one of the best hunters in the area. He also saw some things that bothered him. The young man built shelters in places that seemed impossible, like valleys so deep that Silas thought no one else knew about them. When he came back from these long trips, his movements had a strange energy and vitality that didn't seem right for someone who should be tired. Mary Godfrey, who was 48 years old, never trusted Ezekiel. A person who had lived their whole life on the frontier had sharp instincts, so she put heavy planks on her bar doors when he came over. It was like he saw the forests as a part of himself. Zeke was 25 years old when the county was officially formed in 1821. This helped him build his reputation. He showed up in Prestonburg with a huge load of high-quality beaver pelts, something that would normally take whole teams working for a season to get. He had done better than what groups of people could do. That year, Silas learned something that changed how he thought about his friend. He found signs of a recent fight, blood that didn't belong to an animal, and pieces of Shawnee native fabric while hunting. The hunter didn't deny it when he talked to Zeke. He just said that there was a silent war going on, and that he was doing what he had to do to protect the families who depended on those lands. Silas, torn between loyalty and fear, chose to stay quiet. Zeke was at his best when he was 30 years old in 1826. There were more and more stories about his amazing feats, like killing bears with knives, following panthers through storms, and living in the woods for weeks with broken bones. Each story added to the legend and kept people from asking what really happened deep in those mountains. Settlers praised him, but something bad happened in native communities. Shawnee and Cherokee warriors who went on expeditions just didn't come back. At first, people thought the pattern was caused by accidents or fights between tribes, but it became clear that experienced men were going missing without a trace. The situation blew up in 1829. The tribes started brutal revenge because they couldn't figure out who was behind the disappearances. Cabins in the middle of nowhere were set on fire at night. 5 people, including 3 kids, from the Morrison family, died in a fire. Other innocent families suffered the same fate, being punished for someone else's crime. Silas started having bad dreams. He knew more than he should have, but not enough to do anything. Guilt slowly ate away at him, especially when he went to smoking ruins where families had been torn apart. Mary saw that her husband would wake up sweating and stare at the dark mountains, as if he were waiting for something to come out of the shadows. In the deep woods, in shelters that even experienced Indians didn't know about, a strange collection was quietly growing. Trophies on the walls told the story of a series of horrific events, things that belonged to people who would never be seen again. Shallow graves hid signs of evil that went beyond the usual problems between settlers and natives. Ezekiel Harmon had become more than just a hunter. He had turned into a predator of a different kind, a man who had crossed lines that most people find disgusting. The mountains kept their secrets, but the number of victims kept growing, and each one added weight to a truth that couldn't be hidden any longer. The fall of 1832 would bring the news that would change everything. The hunter and the people who finally figured out how to track him would have one last fight. There would be a confession that would make even the toughest people face the horror that had been living among them. The Appalachian Mountains have long memories, and some memories are so strong that they can never be forgotten. Ezekiel was 15 years old when he crossed the line between human and monster. It was 1811, 3 years after he saw his father's body cut up. In the winter, a wounded Shawnee warrior got stuck near a tributary of the Levisa Fork and lost touch with his group during a snowstorm. He was sitting against a tree, trying to treat a deep wound on his leg, when he saw the young white man come out of the woods. He tried to grab his gun, but he was too weak from blood loss to do so. The warrior's death was just the start. Zeke stayed there for hours, watching the body as the snow slowly covered it. Dark curiosity went beyond just wanting revenge. He remembered stories that veteran trappers told him about tribes that ate other people in far-off places and rituals that supposedly gave them power by eating the flesh of their enemies. He was alone, starving, and driven insane by years of being alone and in pain. He used his father's knife to do things that can't be put into words, but that are very disturbing. When he finally left, something important had changed. And even more troubling, he felt different physically. He had more energy, which he thought was because of the ritual. In the months that followed, he was sure it had worked. He felt stronger, his senses were sharper, and his ability to track things had gotten a lot better. A logical explanation would be that an adolescent's body is growing up, and that years of survival naturally improve skills. But in Ezekiel Harmon's mind, the reason was clear. He had taken his enemy's strength. He killed 5 to 8 Indians between 1811 and 1820. He was careful and picked victims who were alone and vulnerable. Like warriors who wandered too far during hunts, scouts who were alone, and indigenous trappers in remote areas. The same ritual happened for each death. He felt right, strong, and invincible after every act. He came up with complicated ways to hide what he was doing. He remembered where to bury bodies near rock formations or trees that stood out. He took personal things to his secret hideouts. He learned how to preserve scalps by watching how both settlers and natives did it. He rubbed them with salt he traded for in Prestonburg, smoked them over low fires, and hung them up until the leather shrank and hardened. His shelters were works of art in hiding, built in valleys so deep that even experienced Indians rarely found them. Each structure was surrounded by thick plants and had several ways to get out and food for weeks. The main one was in the Shelby Creek Valley, which is a very remote area. To get there, you have to cross 3 mountain ranges, 2 frozen rivers, and a maze of ravines that nature made to keep people out. Zeke had built his own little world inside that simple structure of fitted logs covered in turf, where he kept the trophies from his hunts. He killed between 8 and 10 Indians in a single year in 1826, when he was 30 years old. This was his best year as a hunter and a human predator. Confidence had grown to the point of being rude. He started taking bigger risks, like following whole groups and attacking warriors who were more alert and better armed. Each success made him more sure that he was better than everyone else. Silas Godfrey saw clear changes when he came by from time to time. The hunter had a disturbing amount of energy and a feverish look in his eyes. He said that the forest was alive and talked to him. His movements got faster and more jerky, like those of a predator animal that is always on the lookout. Mary stayed away from him. She saw dark stains under his nails that didn't look like normal hunting dirt, a strange smell on his clothes that wasn't just smoke and sweat, and most importantly, the way he looked at meat during meals made her stomach turn. Standing Bear was a skilled Shawnee warrior who had lost 2 cousins and a younger brother in the mountains. He was aware that something strange was going on. He was 32 years old and one of the best trackers in his tribe when he started his investigation in 1829. He spent months looking for patterns in places where people went missing. He started to notice strange things, marks on trees that didn't follow natural patterns, trails that were purposely hidden, and dried blood on rocks. Too much for a small animal, but no body or sign of dragging. It was easy to see why he was upset. He could follow deer for days through rough terrain and read stories in mud footprints. But this ghost enemy was different. The person who was hunting his people knew the mountains as well as the Shawnee did, maybe even better. They used methods that were both familiar and strange. The revenge that started in 1829 was a last-ditch effort. Indians attacked isolated cabins because they didn't know who was to blame. They hoped to hit the family that was hiding the criminal. But this was a brutal and completely useless strategy. The families were not to blame, and the real criminal went free. After visiting the ruins of the Morrison family, Silas finally talked to Zeke more directly. He found the hunter in one of his backup shelters and wanted to know how far he had gone. Zeke let his friend see the truth for the first time. He admitted to killing Indians and said he was fighting a necessary war. But he didn't tell anyone the most horrible thing. Silas left thinking his friend was a violent vigilante, not knowing that the truth was much worse. The fight got a lot worse in 1830 and 1831. Zeke's twisted mind saw each innocent family killed in revenge as another reason to keep going. He was stuck in a cycle of violence that he had started, but now he used it to justify horrible things. Standing Bear was getting closer and closer to the truth. He had heard about the famous white hunter settlers known as Zeke Harmon. People told stories about this man's superhuman powers that made him even more suspicious. Someone who knew the mountains so well, who vanished without a trace, and who always came back with a lot of game. Could he also be hunting people? In September 1832, there was clear proof. An empty Zeke shelter that had been used years before and left behind. Inside, Standing Bear found things he recognized, like his cousin's necklace and a knife with his brother's unique marks. The news was both devastating and energizing at the same time. Finally, he had a goal. He got together 4 of the best warriors from his tribe. They were great trackers, great archers, and great fighters. He told others what he had found. They made a plan together. They would keep an eye on Ezekiel Harmon, learn his habits, and kill him when they had the chance. They didn't know that Zeke had become almost paranoid about being on guard. His instincts had gotten very sharp after years of avoiding being caught. He could tell when someone was watching him and when things in the forest changed in small ways. In October 1832, he started to feel like something was off, like hunters had turned into prey. Silas could feel the tension rising, even though he had seen changes during Zeke's last visit. The hunter was more on edge, always looking out the windows and keeping his hands close to his weapons. Mary locked herself in her room with a heavy board across the door and wouldn't come out while he was there. Ezekiel Harmon made plans in the depths of Shelby Creek, where he had found a safe place to stay. He checked his weapons, sharpened his knives on smooth river stones, and went over all of the escape routes he had memorized in his head. He wouldn't be easy to catch if they came after him, which he thought they would. He had lived for 21 years since the first death, and had killed more than 30 people without feeling bad about it, only proud. The fight that was coming was going to happen no matter what. It would show how far he could go and how far he couldn't go. The Appalachian Mountains were about to see one of the worst wars in their long history. October 1832. The first cold winds of winter blew through the mountains. The brown and gold carpet that formed when trees lost their leaves made it almost impossible for experienced trackers to move quietly. This change in the seasons was a double-edged sword. Dry leaves would give away the location of both prey and hunters. Weeks of waiting. Standing Bear looked at Ezekiel Harmon's movement patterns with the same discipline that had kept him alive in many fights. He watched from a distance as Zeke checked traps, marked preferred trails, and found 3 secondary shelters. However, the main one, the predator's true lair, remained hidden. 4 of the best warriors from his tribe went with him. Each one was an expert in a different area: tracking, archery, hand-to-hand combat, or endurance. They were a deadly force, but they were looking for an enemy who had spent 20 years learning how to hide. First try at an ambush, Levisa Fork River. Standing Bear figured out that Zeke checked a certain trap line every 3 days, which was a pretty predictable pattern. They set up in strategic spots along the usual path where they could hide and still see clearly. The simple plan was to shoot the first arrow to disable the target and then converge to capture it. Something made Zeke stop when he got closer. Birds that used to sing in that area were now completely quiet. There were no squirrels. The wind carried the faint smell of bear oil that Shawnee warriors used to keep warm in the winter. He stood still for minutes, thinking about each strange thing. The warriors were so scared they could hardly breathe. Zeke finally gave up and went back the way he came, leaving his traps behind and disappearing back into the thick forest. He had read signs that the forest itself gave off, signs that only someone who had spent decades there could see. Standing Bear was both angry and impressed at the same time. The wind was good, and there was no noise or movement. The white predator, however, had found the trap just by looking at how things were normally disturbed. The second try failed before it even started. Zeke saw new footprints in the stream mud that didn't follow normal hunting patterns, so he stayed away from that whole part of the forest. Grey Wolf suggested a change of plans. Instead of waiting for Zeke to come down known paths, they should find his main shelter and attack him at night, when he would be less alert. It was risky because it meant going into Zeke's territory, where he would have all the advantages, but they were so angry that they thought about more extreme options. 4 days of careful watching. Grey Wolf finally found a trail that was almost invisible and led off of what seemed like a random path. It had been carefully hidden, with branches placed in such a way that they discouraged exploration. For an experienced tracker, these hiding places were ironically signs that something important was being kept secret. They finally got to the remote valley by following the trail. A smaller, simpler shelter than expected, logs covered in grass for insulation and camouflage, placed near a water source and hidden behind a rock formation that made it impossible to see from any angle. Standing Bear told everyone to keep an eye on things for a full day. They needed to know when he left, when he came back, and if there were any visitors. They saw Zeke leave in the morning with 3 rifles and a hunting bag over his shoulders. He came back in the late afternoon with a small deer. They also saw that the warriors had left their own horses tied up in a clearing nearby. They had ridden those horses for days to get to that area. What they didn't know was that Zeke already knew. He had seen small signs for days, footprints that looked like they had been disturbed, branches that were broken in strange ways, and animal movement patterns that suggested something scary. His carefully cultivated paranoia was at its peak. He knew someone was looking for him and was getting ready to fight back. There were more than 1 rifle for deer. The night was chosen for the attack because the moon was almost full and the silver light it cast through the trees made it easy to see movement. Under the ghostly light of the moon, Standing Bear and his warriors moved quietly. The cruel plan was to surround the building, set it on fire, and kill Zeke when he came out. If he didn't come out, fire would do the trick. When they finally got into position and Black River lit a torch, they found an empty building. The door was slightly ajar, inviting. There were things hanging on the walls inside that looked familiar, but were also creepy. The moonlight and torch lit them up. A trap. Zeke had left his shelter hours before and climbed to a high point where he could see everything. He had 3 carefully loaded flintlock rifles, and each one could only fire once before needing to be reloaded. He had made the right bet that his prey would find his hideout. He was ready when 5 warriors came up to him, lit by the moon and a torch. The first shot rang out like thunder in the valley. Red Cloud fell right away with a bullet in his chest. He was dead before he hit the ground. Zeke let go of the first rifle and picked up the second. A few seconds later, the second shot rang out. When the bullet went through Grey Wolf's left shoulder, it hurt like crazy and made him spin and fall. Standing Bear acted quickly, figuring out where the shots were coming from and yelling orders. Black River and Running Fox ran away, looking for safety. But Zeke was ready, letting go of the second rifle and picking up the third. A deadly game of cat and mouse in the light of the full moon. Zeke knew all the trees, rocks, and possible paths. The warriors were in a strange place, fighting an enemy who could see them better in the fake silver light. The enemy had turned that area into a battlefield. Black River moved too quickly between positions, and his shadow could be seen against the moonlit sky. The third shot hit him in the side, and the lead ball went through his lungs. He crawled behind a tree and then fell down. His breathing made a horrible gurgling sound. Zeke was out of guns that were loaded. It would be dangerous to reload in the dark. He let go of the third rifle and took out his knife and tomahawk. He had lost his range advantage, but he still had a chance in close combat on terrain he knew well. Standing Bear knew they were going to lose. 2 people are dead, and Grey Wolf is badly hurt. He and Running Fox were the only ones left to fight an enemy who probably only had knives and knew every inch of that valley. He made signals that showed a desperate plan, while Standing Bear made noise and broke branches with his boots on purpose. Running Fox would move quietly in the other direction, flanking the shooter. Risky, since it depends on Zeke seeing the obvious threat. Part of the plan worked. Zeke took the bait and focused on Standing Bear, but he was too experienced to do so completely. His instincts told him when something moved in the background. He felt Running Fox's presence more than he saw it, flanking and turning, just as the warrior came out from behind a tree nearby. The fight was short and violent. Running Fox hit one of Zeke's old rifles with his tomahawk, sending it flying, but Zeke had a knife and a tomahawk. Years of living on the edge have made him a great close combat fighter. They fell together, rolling over the ground, covered in dry leaves that crunched under their struggling bodies. Standing Bear changed the scales. Zeke was so close to Running Fox that he could shoot an arrow without missing. The arrow went through Zeke's chest, just below his right collarbone, and into his muscle. A painful and bloody wound, but not deadly right away. With one last burst of strength, powered by anger and adrenaline, Zeke drove his knife deep into Running Fox's neck. The warrior fell down, blood pouring out. Zeke pushed himself up, even though the arrow was still stuck in his chest and blood was soaking through his shirt around the shaft. Standing Bear came closer and raised his tomahawk for the last blow, but Zeke was still dangerous, even though he was hurt. He turned around and threw his own tomahawk with surprising strength. The blade spun through the air lit by the moon and hit Standing Bear in the right shoulder with such force that it broke bones and tore muscles. The warrior yelled and let go of his weapon. Zeke had an arrow in his chest and blood all over his body. Standing Bear had a tomahawk stuck in his shoulder. They stood across the moonlit valley from each other, both badly hurt predators, waiting for the other to fall. Zeke was the first to move. He knew he couldn't win another long fight. He used all of his strength to turn around and start running, stumbling through the woods. With each step, the arrow moved, sending waves of pain through him. But he kept going. Standing Bear put his hand on his wound and thought about chasing after him. He looked around and saw death. Red Cloud died right away. Black River is probably dead because his breathing is getting weaker. Running Fox is definitely dead. Blood is pooling in a dark spot. Grey Wolf was bleeding heavily from his shoulder and could barely stand, even with help. He needed help right away, or he would die before dawn. He had led 4 brave warriors into battle, but now 3 were dead, and 1 was badly hurt. He was hurt, and the predator had gotten away. But he could see the blood trail Zeke left behind. It was dark and bright in the moonlight. No man could live after losing that much blood. He let the white ghost go because he thought he would die from his wounds alone in the woods. It was a small comfort, but it was still a comfort. Zeke kept going through the forest for 15 minutes, using only his willpower. The arrow was still stuck in him, and the shaft hit his arm as he walked. He got to a small clearing where the warriors had tied up their horses. The animals were neighing nervously because they could smell blood. Zeke climbed on one of the animals with superhuman effort. Every move sent sharp pains through his body. He held on to the reins out of pure instinct, going in and out of consciousness as the horse galloped down familiar paths in the dark. Zeke got off the horse, or rather, fell off, when he finally got to the edge of the Godfrey farm. It was just before dawn when he got there. He crawled the last few meters to the door, leaving a trail of blood behind him, and then he fell ill. Mary found him when she opened the door at dawn to feed the chickens. Silas woke up when she screamed in shock. He ran outside and found his old friend on the porch floor, bleeding and with an arrow in his chest. He was still alive, and his gray eyes were still burning with the unsettling intensity that never left him. The Appalachian Mountains had seen the end of Ezekiel Harmon's invincibility, but the real horror of what he had done in his life was still to come. Mary helped Silas carry the bloody body inside. She didn't want to watch someone die on her porch, but she couldn't just stand there and do nothing. They put him in a back room on old sheets that would get ruined by blood. The amount was so shocking that it soaked everything almost right away. The arrow wound was terrible. It had gone through just below his right collarbone, and the shaft stuck out of his body and moved a little with each banful breath. His shirt was completely soaked with blood. Silas knew that trying to take it out without the right help could make the bleeding worse, but leaving it there was also risky. Zeke went back and forth between being awake and asleep for the first few hours. Mary made strong tea from willow bark, which was the best thing they could do. Silas was able to get Zeke to drink some, but a lot of it ran down the sides of his mouth. He had to try to pull out the arrow. He heated a knife in the fire until it turned red, which was the best way he knew how to clean it. He cut around the arrow while Mary held Zeke as still as she could. This made the wound bigger. When the tip finally came out, Zeke screamed and blood poured out. While Mary made a herbal poultice, Silas pressed clean cloths together and kept them that way. They were able to clean and bandage properly after the arrow was taken out and the bleeding stopped. Zeke had passed out during the process, which may have been a good thing. They did what they could, but they both knew that infection was likely. On the frontier, deep puncture wounds often killed people, not because of the injury itself, but because of the fever that followed. On the second day in the afternoon, Zeke woke up enough to talk clearly. He had a fever, and even though he was covered in blankets, his body shook uncontrollably. His skin was hot and cold sweat. When his eyes finally focused on Silas's face, leaning over the bed, they had a strange clarity, as if being close to death had burned away the fogs that usually cloud people's thoughts. Silas was by himself. Mary had gone outside to take care of the animals, which she did on purpose to make the job last longer. Zeke moved his lips a few times before he said anything. His voice was weak, but determined. He had to say something. There were things that had to be said before it was too late. Ezekiel Harmon said things that were so disturbing in the next few hours that Silas thought about getting up and leaving several times, letting the man die alone. But something made him stay and listen. Maybe years of friendship, or a sick need to know everything. Zeke got right to the point. He talked about the first Indian he had killed in 1811, but then he told Silas something that made his stomach turn. The ritual he had done, and how he thought eating his enemy's flesh would give him strength and abilities. Silas suddenly stood up, sending the chair flying. He stumbled to the door, pushed it open, and fell to his knees on the porch. He threw up in violent waves, and his body shook as he tried to make sense of what he had just heard. He stayed there for minutes, his hands shaking and cold sweat dripping. Zeke was watching him with those empty gray eyes, waiting for him to keep listening when he finally got up and went back to the room. At first he thought it was delirium caused by a fever, too crazy to be true. But Zeke kept going, and his voice got stronger in a strange way. He talked about how he had kept doing that ritual over the years, how each victim had made him believe it worked, and how he had convinced himself that his amazing powers came directly from this horrible practice. He talked about his secret hideouts, especially the one in Shelby Creek, that was the most important. There were dozens of scalps hanging on the walls, each one representing a life lost. He couldn't write because he had never learned how to read or write letters, but he could keep track of things on tree bark and leather. He made simple notches and lines to show deaths. Some of the symbols were only understood by him: circles for Shawnee, crosses for Cherokee. They were a simple but organized way for him to keep track of his killings. Things he had gathered: tomahawks, knives, and decorations that belonged to people who would never see their families again. He talked about the bodies buried behind the shelter, saying that he had lost count of how many men he had lost. Maybe 12 or 13. This was perhaps the most disturbing thing about him. He didn't feel bad about it. He had killed Indians, eaten some of them, and buried them in shallow graves in rocky soil. Some were found by wild animals, while others were not. Tombs marked only in his memory, and with notches he had made on trees nearby. These were signs that only he could understand. The question Silas finally came up with was, why? Not why he had killed. He thought he could understand that because of the trauma and harsh conditions. But why that specific way, which was so horrible and outside of any moral code? Why killing enemies wasn't enough? Zeke tried to explain how he could take on the traits of his victims. After each ritual, he felt stronger, faster, and sharper. He had convinced himself that he was becoming something more than human, a better predator that combined the intelligence of a white man with the instincts of an Indian. It was clear that he had lost his mind a long time ago, as his obsession and unresolved trauma had taken over his reason. Even more troubling, Zeke really thought his actions were right. He said that he had kept settlers safe for decades. Indians had learned to stay away from those mountains because they were scary. The meat and pelts he brought in helped families do well. Ezekiel Harmon thought he wasn't a monster, but a guardian who was protecting his people the only way he knew how. Silas tried to get Zeke to understand how horrible it was for innocent families to be killed in retaliation by Native Americans. For example, the Morrisons and others who died in their cabins because tribes couldn't find the real killer. Zeke just kept saying that the attacking Indians, not him, were to blame for the deaths. He had done what he needed to do. If others had suffered, it was a tragedy. But it wasn't his fault. At that moment, Mary came back. She stopped at the door and looked from Silas, whose face was pale and shocked, to Zeke, whose eyes were bright with fever and something else. She hadn't heard any specific words, but the room felt heavy. When she asked what was going on, Silas just shook his head and couldn't say anything. In the days that followed, the infection got worse. The fever got worse until he was delirious. Zeke talked to people he couldn't see during these times. "Father, watch. I'm stronger now. I took their strength." Other times, he yelled orders in a language that Silas didn't understand, a mix of Shawnee and English. And at one point, hours before he died, he whispered names like Red Hawk, Standing Tree, and Winter Wolf. Silas realized with growing horror that these were probably the names of his victims, kept in a dark corner of Zeke's mind. On the fourth day, just before dawn, Zeke died. His last words, which he whispered so softly that Silas had to lean in to hear, were about not regretting anything. He would make the same choices if he could live again. Indians had taken his father, and he had taken their souls in return. Then his gray eyes lost their shine. The cannibal from the Appalachians, Ezekiel Harmon, was dead. Silas sat next to the body for a long time, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything and come to terms with the friend he had known and the monster that had been revealed. Mary finally came in and saw the body lying still. She started to cry, but not for Zeke. She cried for her husband, who was clearly in shock. It looked like Silas had aged 10 years in 4 days when he came out of the room. He told Mary about the confession, but not all the graphic details. His wife listened in more and more horror. "Be quiet." She asked him the only question that mattered when he was done. What would they do with this information now? They should tell the leaders of the community in Prestonburg what Zeke had said. But that would mean admitting that he had been hiding a killer for years. It would mean that the Shelby Creek shelter would be found, the horrors would be revealed, and the area would be forever tainted by having sheltered such a monster. There was also a practical reason. Making such a revelation would likely lead to more violence. If tribes found out everything Zeke did, they might start their attacks again, this time on more innocent families. Conflicts that were finally starting to die down could start up again, killing more people. They talked for a long time before making a choice that would stay with them. They would bury Ezekiel quietly, without marking the grave or talking about it in public. But they would go to Shelby Creek, find the shelter that was described, and see if the confession was true or just a crazy idea. Before noon, the body was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the property. No words, no ceremony. Silas dug the hole, put the body in it, and covered it with dirt. He stayed there for a moment, looking at the pile of fresh dirt and remembering decades of friendship built on a foundation of fear. Mary made food while Silas packed up tools. Neither of them said much. They were both thinking about what they had learned and what they were about to see. They finally left when the sun was high, following the directions Zeke had given them. The trip to the remote valley took longer than Silas had thought it would. The terrain was just as hard as he had said it would be. They almost gave up a few times, but they kept going. When the sun set in the west, they reached the small valley surrounded by mountains. The shelter was exactly where Zeke said it would be, behind a rock formation that was almost impossible to see until they were right on top of it. The door was slightly open, which is probably how he left it when he never came back. They stood at the door for a long time, not sure if they should actually go inside and see if the nightmares they had confessed to were real. Mary finally opened the door all the way and went inside. When her eyes got used to the dark, she screamed, and her voice echoed through the valley. There, just as Zeke had said, were about 35 to 40 human scalps hanging in neat rows, and that was just the first of the shocking things that would happen in the Appalachian cannibal's lair. The scream of Mary sounded like the cry of a hurt animal echoing through the valley. Silas ran inside with his heart racing. He understood right away when his eyes got used to the low light. There were about 35 to 40 human scalps hanging from hooks on the beams on the other wall. They were all in neat rows, which made it look like they were being cared for very carefully. Zeke had clearly mastered the methods he used to preserve each one. The newest one, which was 1 or 2 years old, still had mostly intact black hair, but it was starting to fade and become brittle. But the old ones, which were 15 or 20 years old, were almost unrecognizable. The leather on the old scalps had shrunk and warped, making them hard and brittle like old parchment. The hair had completely lost its natural color and turned into brittle grayish tufts, or in many cases, it had fallen out completely. Some were just odd pieces of hardened tissue that looked more like old artifacts than new trophies. Mary couldn't handle it anymore. She turned around and ran out of the shelter, but she tripped at the door. Silas saw her on her knees 20 yards away a few minutes later, throwing up violently. Mary pushed him away and shook her head a lot when he tried to help her up. It looked like she was trying to pray, but her lips moved without making any sound. She couldn't breathe normally for 10 minutes, and even then, she wouldn't look at the shelter. Silas went back inside by himself and made himself keep going with the test. As his eyes got used to the light, more terrible things came to light. There was a whole wall of weapons, tomahawks from different tribes with handles that looked like they belonged to important warriors, knives of all sizes, some clearly made by Native Americans and others by Europeans, bows and quivers, and 6 rifles leaning against a wall. Basic shelves held hundreds of smaller items, like bear claw necklaces that showed bravery, beaded bracelets with tribal meanings in complicated patterns, and ceremonial feather ornaments. Each item was not just stolen property. It was a story, a person, and a life that had been violently cut short. There were also things that were disturbing in their normality. A leather pouch with seeds that someone would never see grow. Carefully worked flint, a tool that took hours to make, and an amulet carved from bone in the shape of a bird, maybe made by a father for his son, or a mother for her daughter. Silas went deeper. A table with neatly arranged tools was in a secluded area that was partially hidden by a curtain. There were knives of different sizes, blades that shone from being cared for with river stones in a wooden container, metal hooks, and small saws. Silas couldn't and didn't want to guess what these tools were for. There were a lot of different containers on the shelves. Some were carefully carved wood, and others were dried animal bladders that had been tied and sealed. Silas opened one and found coarse salt, big uneven crystals that had been collected from natural springs, dried herbs, and common seasonings. Another container has small bones that have been cleaned and broken up to get the marrow out. A heavy leather pouch was next to it. Silas opened it and stopped in his tracks, teeth from a person. There were dozens of them, maybe 50 or more of different sizes. Some were big, from adults, and some were small and delicate, from kids or teens. They were all carefully arranged, like a collector would arrange rare coins. Silas dropped the pouch like it was on fire, and bile rose in his throat again. Mary found a pile of things that looked like personal records near the bed. There were no words written down, but they were pieces of tree bark and leather, with marks and simple symbols on them. Silas looked at each one. A mark stood for a victim. Some lines are simple and some are grouped together. Some had extra symbols like rough circles that were probably Shawnee and simple crosses that meant Cherokee. A creepy ledger kept by a man who never learned to read or write but felt the need to keep track of his killings. A bigger piece of leather had simple drawings of people with lines and X's, as well as symbols for things like weapons or trophies from each victim. It was like a murder map made by someone who couldn't write but needed to document, remember, and relive. Mary gave Silas the pieces. There are some things that shouldn't be kept. He threw them in the corner and planned to set everything on fire. But first, they had to check the second part of the confession, the bodies buried behind the shelter. Silas didn't want to. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to leave Eve and never come back. But they had to know for sure that the confession was true. It was clear that the ground behind the shelter had been disturbed in many places. There were depressions where the earth had settled, and areas where plants grew differently and denser, which suggested that decomposition was making the soil richer. Animals had dug in 2 places, revealing some of the contents. Silas walked up to a part of the ground that had been dug up and made himself look. Wild animals partially uncovered human bones that had been whitened by time and the elements. Mary didn't want to look and stayed close to the shelter, her eyes firmly fixed on something else. Silas counted at least 8 or 9 different sites, but he thought there were more that were well hidden. Zeke's admission of more than 10 bodies was probably true, and it might have been conservative. He used a shovel to cover the bones that were still showing, even though he knew it was pointless because animals would dig them up again. He felt like he had to do something to show them respect, even though he could never give them proper burials or tell their families. When they went back inside, they had to make a tough choice. Letting community leaders in Prestonburg know what happened would help families find closure. But it would also have very bad effects. Standing Bear and his warriors would find out about the cannibalism, which would start new fights. Families who were hurt would be horrified. People would think Silas was guilty if he didn't say anything. They talked in a low voice and then made their choice. They would set fire to the shelter and everything inside, including scalps, weapons, records, and other things. Everything would turn to ash. They wouldn't bother any more bodies, leaving them for the mountain to take back. They would never tell anyone what they found, and they would take the secret to their own graves. Silas knew it was a cowardly choice. It was unfair to the victims and their families, but it was also practical and might have stopped more bloodshed. Having seen enough horror, they chose the path that would do the least harm. They put everything inside, scalps in the middle, clothes, blankets, and records on top. Mary shivered every time she touched one. Silas started the fire and kept it going until it was strong. As the flames grew and consumed the inside, thick, sickening smoke rose, smelling like burning leather, fabric, wood, and something more natural and disturbing. The shelter was on fire all night. Silas and Mary set up camp at a safe distance and kept an eye on things. They saw the flames eat away at the building, with beams crashing down in bursts of sparks and walls falling. There was a lot of smoke rising in a thick column that could be seen for miles, but no one was there to see it in that quiet valley. When dawn broke, all that was left were a pile of ashes and blackened logs. Silas spread the ashes and buried the bigger pieces that hadn't burned yet. He stirred them carefully to make sure the scalps were all gone. There were no objects that could be seen. For a long time after Mary left, Silas stayed alone in front of the ashes. He had just destroyed proof of more than 30 murders, including scalps that could have brought closure to families and things that belonged to sons, brothers, and fathers. He had turned everything into dust and smoke with his own hands. It couldn't be undone. There was no way to go back. He was no longer just a witness to horror. He was also helping to hide it. This truth would be with him until he died. In a few months, plants would take over the area again. In a few years, it would be hard to tell that there had ever been a shelter there. Mary picked up stones from a nearby riverbed and put them over the obvious graves before she left Shelby Creek. They weren't fancy markers with names or inscriptions, but they were something. A way to remember that people died there and lives were taken. It was a small gesture, but it was better than nothing. There was almost no noise on the way back. They were both tired out physically and mentally. Mary locked herself in the room on their property where Silas could hear her crying. He sat on the steps of the porch and watched the sun rise over the mountains in the distance. In the weeks and months that followed, they tried to get back to normal. They kept their promise and never talked about Ezekiel or Shelby Creek. When people in the neighborhood asked about Zeke, Silas said that he probably moved west to find new places to hunt. People believed the answer without question. Frontier men often vanished, always heading toward the next mountain. Eventually, Standing Bear and the other warriors left the mountains. As Indians were moved to reservations, the tension between settlers and tribes slowly went down. People stopped going missing. Families who lost loved ones never knew what really happened, and they had to live with that uncertainty for the rest of their lives. Silas lived for 23 more years and died in 1855. Mary lived for only 2 years after him, until 1857. She made Silas promise again that the secret would die with them as she lay dying. Silas kept his word and took all of his knowledge to the grave. No one ever found the Shelby Creek shelter again. The valley was so hard to get to that even hunters didn't go there very often. The bones so slowly broke down and disappeared back into the mountain, where the ancient earth kept its secrets. Legends, on the other hand, last longer than facts. Years later, people told stories about a ghost that haunted some valleys. They said they saw a thin man with gray eyes walking silently at dusk. Some people said he was still hunting for prey he could never catch again. The Shawnee and Cherokee descendants also kept telling stories. Oral history told of a terrible time when warriors vanished without a trace, and a ghost predator hunted hunters. Some versions talked about cannibal creatures from their own tribal stories. Legends made things seem simpler than they really were. Ezekiel Harmon wasn't a ghost or a supernatural being. He was just a man who had been hurt and let hatred and pain take over his humanity. He crossed lines that were wrong. He was shaped by the brutal violence of life on the frontier and deadly wars that were going on at the time. But knowing why doesn't make actions okay. Ezekiel Harmon made his own choices, and he chose to be a monster. He killed more than 30 people for no good reason. He didn't just kill. He also committed profanations, which went against all moral codes. He died without feeling sorry, thinking until the end that what he did was right. For thousands of years, the Appalachian Mountains have seen many tragedies. They saw native empires come and go, European settlers come, and bloody wars. They took in blood from a lot of wars, fights, and murders, and buried in all of these stories, where only the mountains knew about it, was the secret of the cannibal in the area. In a remote valley called Shelby Creek, under thick vegetation that took back the land, stones marked the graves of men who were buried far from their families and tribes. Their stories died with them. Their names were forgotten, and their lives were reduced to numbers in the gruesome count of the predator who hunted them. We don't know who they were, but they should be remembered. Ezekiel Harmon's body is buried in an unmarked grave on the property that used to belong to Silas and Mary. There is no stone to mark the spot, and there is no name to remember who is buried there. This is fitting for a man who left behind a legacy of horror so terrible that even the people who knew him best chose to erase any record of his existence. Mountains keep their secrets well, but if you listen, you can learn from the stories buried among the old peaks. For example, how untreated trauma can turn into a monster, how being alone and isolated can change your mind in ways you can't even imagine, and how easily the lines between justice and revenge, protection and predation become blurry when civilization is far away. There are no easy answers in the story of Ezekiel Harmon. It's just a dark record of how bad things can get for people when they are put in the worst possible situations. A reminder that monsters aren't always supernatural beings. Sometimes they're just people who have lost or given up their humanity. The Appalachians have always been known for their wild beauty and hidden dangers, with deep valleys and peaks covered in mist. Ezekiel Harmon, the cannibal hillbilly, is just one of the many sad stories that have happened in these old mountains. But it makes us think about uncomfortable things like human nature, the limits of morality in war, and how easily normal people become predators when the right conditions are met. Silas and Mary Godfrey decided to burn the proof and bury the truth. We can judge their choice, but not really condemn it, because they lived in a time when formal justice was a distant idea. Violence was common, and news of horrible things could have led to revenge that killed more innocent people. We should remember the more than 30 Shawnee and Cherokee warriors who were killed by Ezekiel Harmon. We will never know their names. They were men who had families, stories, hopes, and fears. They became trophies in a creepy museum. The predator who killed them saw them not as people, but as symbols of his own pain and tools for his perceived power. Ezekiel Harmon, the man who turned into a monster, is a disturbing reminder that the line between human and inhuman is not as clear as we would like to think. He started out as a victim, a 12-year-old boy who saw his father brutally killed, but being a victim doesn't make up for the bad choices, lines crossed, and profanities he made over the years. There are no clear moral lessons or satisfying endings in stories like this. They are just records of the terrible and complicated things that people do when they are put in very bad situations. They make us think about the darker sides of our species in a way that doesn't glorify or justify them, but instead tries to understand them so that we can avoid similar tragedies in the future. But mountains don't forget. As long as we are willing to face the dark parts of our shared history, these stories will continue to exist, not to entertain or shock, but to bear witness to and keep alive uncomfortable but important truths that we need to face. Thanks for coming along on this trip through a story from the Appalachians. If you liked this in-depth look, you might want to subscribe to Legacy of Fear for more stories that look at the darker parts of human history. Keep in mind that some stories are based on real events that are scarier than anything we could make up.